Great. So let's start today's webinar. I really appreciate everyone for joining. BIM Pakistan is a platform for Pakistan AECO industry. It is a leading professional national society for BIM and digitalization in AECO sector of Pakistan. We have multiple initiatives. We have our strategic partners helping us. For sure, Plannerly is one of our strategic partners. And our vision is to step up with the vision to transform the building and infrastructure industry to the most advanced feature and processes of digital construction techniques. So please join in Pakistan. This is your community. And we appreciate Plannerly as they have organized a webinar for us. So our host today is Clive. A short introduction for Clive. Clive is a civil engineer turned contractor turned architect and then owner, like many of the roles you have played throughout your life, Clive. Really remarkable. And he's now a tech company co-founder for a second AEC startup. He's also helping teams to simplify their ISO 19650 accreditations. And believe me, if you have any question regarding 19650, if you have any query regarding BIM workflows, you are seeing like the right person on your screens. So I would like to call Clive to start the presentation. Let's learn from you, Clive.
So welcome everybody. We're going to talk about ISO 19650. The agenda will be to look at why standards are important. Why do we need them? What ISO 19650 can do for us. And then when we look at the documents, all of the resources that ISO 19650 requires, what are you able to do with them? How can you put them into a workflow? And how do you make it more efficient? And we'll share some learning resources as well at the end. So look out for those. The first question though, teams have said on the chat and also in the Q&A and the answering our questions in our poll that they're using BIM already. But what does BIM look like? What is BIM? Let's start with that first basic question. How about this, Akash? Is this BIM?
Yeah, it's BIM. Absolutely. It looks like BIM.
It does. I agree. There's some walls and floors and beams and columns and things like that. It looks like BIM. But what about this? What about when we add a bit more? So we see all of the mullions and we see more of a profiled beam and we see layers. We start to see changes in the elevation of the ceiling. Is this BIM? What's this?
Yeah, it seems to be more BIM. But it's still BIM, isn't it?
Perfect. Yeah, and I'm sure that there's more information related to those. There's much more accuracy. Maybe there's links to other external sources of information. What about this one? Is this BIM?
Yeah, so you are trying to confuse me, right? All of these seems to be BIM, but there is a tiny bit of difference in between those images.
Yeah, and that's the difference that we will talk about and really introduce why planning this early, why we can try to do our best to understand who should be responsible for what and make sure that nobody does too much too soon or too little too late. And that's where we have this big challenge in industry that some teams might want more BIM, some teams might want less BIM. And so that really is a good discussion point because an owner might have a completely different concept of what BIM can do for them compared to one of the contractors or subcontractors. And in order to help us, historically, there have been many guidelines, many best practices and standards when it comes to using BIM. And you probably have heard of a lot of the ones that are on the screen. And one that has been pretty prevalent is the concept of level of development and level of detail, the concept of understanding progression of a design. Well, it's not just geometry, but it's also the information and the accuracy and all of this reliable information as it progresses through becomes hopefully more reliable and more coordinated with other teams. But these standards so far that have been trying to help us, we ask, what's happened in those last few years? This is a survey that shows not very good results. Akash, I remember when we first saw these results, it was pretty shocking. But what do you see in this picture? What do you see as being the challenge?
Some of the challenges, maybe starting with the worst case scenario, is no discussion about the requirements. So doing BIM for a certain kind of BIM, but not knowing how it is going to be used downstream and what the value and what the targets and purposes of creating BIM. And that's 1/3 of the cases when there is no discussion about it at all. In other cases, yeah, we just also say, BIM, please, we have to do BIM. But again, that's pretty much seems to be the same kind of approach, not exactly clarifying what BIM means in those cases, right?
Yep, absolutely. So we've got this big problem of not having clarity. And then almost on the other end of the scale where we do have clarity is only 2%, 1.8% of the projects that we work on. That's a big problem. If we have millions and billions of euro, dollar, pound, yens into construction, design and construction, and there's not clear goals on exactly what we're trying to get from BIM. So this, unfortunately, where we are seeing lots of miscommunication happening, it's still creating this problem of people missing information. How do I do my job if I don't get the information that I need? And when I have a model, when I start to create BIM, I also see lots and lots of problems, lots of clashes in my model. I also see far too much modeling, maybe. Maybe they're going in and modeling detail that is not required by everyone. And also this communication challenge. So we have in our industry this, well, how do I agree on what my scope is? And how do I agree when I have to hand this in to who do I have to hand it in? And how do I get verified that it's my work, that it's been done, that I'm going to get paid for it? This is a real challenge in our industry. So not just those challenges, but many more, missing, not integrated information and standards and data and tools and rework and conflicts. And all of this is a big, big challenge. But don't worry, because this is where ISO 19650 comes in. ISO 19650 is all about understanding that it's a challenge and putting workflow to it. So we help by having concepts and principles with regard to information management and BIM management. And it really is applied to any type of project. So it's not just for a specific building type or a road or rail, it's any type of project. And it's a unified approach. So absolutely so happy for our industry that instead of having lots and lots of different standards that they have to work to, we have one standard that is now internationally recognized, and we can follow that same path. And it has support from the UK in the UK BIM framework to help us and to implement with a purpose. So it's really, really powerful to get there. And that principle of it's not just one country, it's actually being adopted by many governments and globally. So it's a unified standard. It's something that we can help talk a common language across all projects, and it's applied in many, many countries. But what is this? What is this thing that we call ISO 19650? Let's take a look. Well, I have some of it here is the top few layers of my BIM stack of documentation that sits on my desk. And it's a set of standards that are actually a series of standards, and different parts will explain different pieces of the workflow. The first is concepts and principles. The second is really a core part, which helps you to understand the whole workflow, from understanding the need with the owner, defining purpose, defining scope, taking it all the way through to delivering, checking, and closing out a project. That's the one that we will go through in detail. But there are also very focused parts that are just saying, let's look at a security-minded approach. Let's look at how we manage from an operations perspective. It's really, really powerful, but we're going to focus on the workflow that cuts through all of those. This workflow, the ISO 19650 Part 2, so it's the Part 2 in the series, has a really well-renowned process map. And that process map, it gives us 8 different steps that we can see. And this is the information management when it comes to BIM, all the way through that workflow. And if we unpack each one of these, fortunately and also unfortunately, it will open up into a more steps, a larger diagram. So we'll see all of these as we see each piece of the workflow. And this is where we start with assessment and need, and we go through the tendering process to get procurement, we deliver, and we're going through the checking and closing out. So as we go through these different 8 steps, let's unpack one of those so that or a couple of those, so we can see how much and how we go through it and what it actually means. So let's look at those first 3. The first one is this assessment and need. How do we understand what is required, who the owner is, and why are they doing BIM in the first place? There are different steps here inside of the steps so that we can unpack even more requirements and resources that are needed. From an example here, establishing the project information requirements, which includes the scope and the purpose and the plan of work and how you're going to procure it, etc., throughout the project. So the good and the bad of having a workflow is that it gets very detailed, but The good part is that everyone's following the same workflow. So it's repeatable. You don't have to learn new standards. Everyone talks the same language. Your work is valuable in any country that is implementing ISO 19650. The documents that support this workflow, I mentioned they're a project information requirements resource, but we also have lots of others that are required in this process. The first one here, organizational requirements. That's what are the business benefits for the owner? What are they trying to achieve? What assets are they interested in understanding more about? How are they planning their portfolio? All of this is really, really key. Then we're looking at project-based requirements. Then we're looking at assets specifically and the information required from an asset, whether it's a facility at large or whether it's a specific pump in a specific room. Then we're looking at exchange information requirements. And then we're looking at a whole bunch of other things that also includes maybe some of the familiar terms like the BIM execution plan. And here we have a workflow that helps us to put these together. But it might be quite confusing at this point because so many documents, so many steps, and so much of this might be new. And all of these acronyms are also potentially new. The OIR, Organizational Information Requirements, the PIR, Project Information Requirements, AIR, Asset Information Requirements. We've already got BIM and BEP, and we've got LOD. That's another story entirely. But the principle is that some of this could be new and it could be confusing. But don't worry, please don't worry. We're going to go step by step, and we're also going to provide lots of supporting material, process maps that simplify the workflow, and critical part, lots of templates. So inside of Plannerly, we provide templates, not just to get you started, but to take you through the whole workflow. So look out for those as resources at the end of this presentation. But let's take a step-by-step approach. So the ISO 19650 workflow, if we have swim lanes to represent the client, the owner, or in ISO terms called the appointing party, the person that appoints the other teams, the major leads, the lead appointed party or parties there where an owner might say, I'm going to employ a contractor and an architect, and they will be my leads for certain parts of the workflow, or one primary lead. That is the person coordinating all of the other teams. And then the appointed party or parties that form all of the task teams. And these teams are the ones that are actually doing the work. These are different swim lanes in the diagram that we see with the 8 steps. So the 8 steps along the top, from assessment, what do I need as an owner, through to tendering and procuring, appointing, creating information, validating, and going through to closing out a project. So the end-to-end workflow. Let's take a look at these steps inside of it. Don't have to understand everything to start with, but to make it simple in our presentation, we're going to break it into 3 main pieces. The first part we'll talk about is how you go through to ask for something as a tender process, how you respond, and how you appoint somebody. So this process to get something of a response, whether it's a pre-appointment BIM execution plan, or whether it's when you actually are appointing and getting through a detailed responsibility matrix. That's the process to get contracted. And then at the end, we'll talk about how you use this structured data to make your workflows and the checking of that much easier as we go through to closing out a project and learning from it. The good thing is that this diagram is available also for you, and Akash will share the link so that you have that in the chat. But being able to use this diagram to explain to other people in the teams that you work with, it's available for you to start doing that. So let's take a look. Step 1, the tender process. This incorporates evaluating what's needed and asking for it. And the resources that are needed are the organizational, the project, the asset, and all forms the exchange information requirements. What the owner needs to do if they're not able to do it themselves, they need to appoint, and even if it's them doing it, they need to appoint specifically an information management function. Who is going to be the person that manages this workflow, gathers all of this so that they can create the tender? And that's a really important job. And it might be you on the call. You might be a BIM consultant that supports these owners. And that is a really, really important role and very, very instrumental in the process. So to start with, I mentioned we have some templates. So to create the OIR, PIR, EIR, essentially the EIR overall, we are simply going into Plannerly or another tool that you use, checking the boxes to say which templates you want to create. And they are the templates that are ready for you to start with the workflow. What you really should focus on, because there are so many different resources, different documents, you should focus on keeping them all together. And this is a really, really important part, because it can be very difficult to manage from an administration perspective if you don't keep those together. But you also need to have security around who has access to certain documents at certain times. So you could manage these as a bunch of Word files in a lot of different places, and maybe in SharePoint or other tools. But the best advice that I can share is, because you've got so many resources, keep them together. And as you start to define the asset requirements, you need to define a purpose. So ISO 19650 is all about, how do you have a purpose so that you can make sure that the BIM being created is going to serve a purpose and have value for a customer. So the asset information requirements part is shown here as a list of assets. And we have a template for this as well, so it makes it much easier inside of the tool, but you can list it in an Excel spreadsheet if you wanted to. Here we're showing the visual nature of all of the assets that are required. And we're also able to define the information requirements for each of these. So the important part through level of information need, and explaining lots of concepts in this very short period of time. But when we understand level of development or level of detail, what we're now progressing towards is this concept of level of information need, which is encompassing the geometry required, the information, and the documentation required for that specific asset, for that purpose, or for that container of information. There's a lot more to it, but just to scratch the surface, defining that list and having the ability then to add these specific information requirements, whether it's a warranty date, and assigning it to this storage tank that the owner needs to register an asset in their asset information requirements, and being able to assign that to a specific team so that teams know exactly what BIM they need to provide, what information they need to provide, and also what documentation they need to provide as well. As you're going through this process, you're building these resources, you're building the project, the organizational, essentially all of these exchange information requirements. But the important part is then tendering and getting teams involved. So there's this concept of a prospective team, a team that's not yet on the project, where they can start to add their assignments and respond to and start to get involved in that tender. So the first part is this assessment of what the owner needs. Do they need a model for operation and maintenance? What information do they need? Do they need to understand the warranty details, when that operational asset is going to be maintained? And if it goes wrong, who do I call? And at some point, the tender response kicks in, where you are inviting teams to say, this is how I'm going to perform these tasks. And my process in order to meet your requirements in my BIM execution plan, understanding the risks and how I'm going to mobilize my team, becomes my tender response. So let's dig into this next step, step 2. It's the appointment process. And it's really about how teams can respond to your exchange information requirements, or the owner's exchange information requirements, with a pre-appointment BIM execution plan, with risks and mobilization plan in order to mitigate all of these risks. Essentially be able to check that the place where you're going to store all of the data, that it works, making sure that all of the teams are capable in delivering. And then at a certain point in time, the owner, the lead appointing party, appoints somebody. And as a lead appointed party, lead, appointing, appointed, appointor, appointee. There's lots of terms that can get you can get tongue-tied in them, but it's very specific. So understanding the different types of role is really important as well. Here, this appointed party, this is the lead, they then start to develop much more detailed requirements with what's called the task information delivery plans from all of the task teams, all of the other teams that are working under that lead. They would then supply their task lists, and in a very basic form, they would be merged into a master list that becomes what the delivery plan is to move the project forward and what's tracked and controlled. So let's take a look at how we might do this and manage these two steps. So we looked at the resources of the mobilization plan, risk register, task and master information delivery plan, and BIM execution plan. This is really where we would start to, again, use templates. So we have, thankfully, templates for every single one of these. You can start to complete them, and whether it's checking that we have resources, or whether it's checking that the software is going to run and do exactly what we need, or whether it's finding out that there is a need for some training to deliver. That's all part of this assessment of whether we can achieve what those requirements are. The next start, we start talking about these task lists. And thankfully, again, we have templates for this, but the task and master information delivery plans and the responsibility matrix get added to the asset list. So we had that asset list from the first step that the owner said that they need. And then we have a list of items that teams are responsible for from a delivery perspective, whether it's get this report or whether it's a certain certification or a drawing. And then also the responsibility matrix, whether that's could be somebody modeling the pump that we just talked about, or adding certain information, or creating a virtual reality walkthrough. All of these tasks are structured data that can be then created pretty quickly by drag and drop and assigned to the right team members. This structured data, mentioned whether it's a 3D model element or here it's a specific task that's required, helps to communicate everything in the same place. So these become what are called information containers at its raw form. It's a container of here requirements, of information requirements. And in this example, we're showing a list of all of them that can be easily assigned to teams that understand then what they need to do and when they need to do it. But if you have all of that in a database, what happens? It can just sit there unless people are contracted for it. So the really interesting part is to be able to cut and slice for each responsibility. So what we see here is saying for just the handover, we're going to contract the contractor and print their requirements, filter it all out as a PDF. So really make it very simple to cut and slice these documents and then get a signature. Because we're going to use BIM, we are a digital and pioneering company, and therefore we will use e-signature as well. Thankfully, Plannerly has that built into the workflow to make it super simple as well. And it stores all of those contracts, legally binding contracts, in the same place with everyone's signature on as well, so that everyone knows exactly what they need to do. But once we've created all of this data and teams go off and start building models, how do we know that they're building the right data, the right models, and providing it at the right time? Well, connecting into a CDE or dragging and dropping the deliverable inside of Plannerly, we can start to check that. And that's a really fun step as we move into the third part in this workflow. And don't forget, I've got some resources for you afterwards. So let's take a look at how we would start to check the data. And then let's look at some resources, and I'll share some links, and we'll be open for some Q&A as well. So the last part in that workflow is using the structured data. Once you've created it, wouldn't it be great if you could make the other project management pieces of the workflow easier? Well, thankfully, we are able to do that and collaboratively plan the list of tasks and simplify the updates by just saying it's now ready for review and has a different status code. By dragging and dropping, that's simply making it easy to make that update. Then, how do we use the data to check it? Well, connecting with Dynamo and Revit, we can start applying parameters, for example, automatically from the Plannerly database. We can start to check them inside of these tools as well. Using ArchiCAD is another example where we can dump an XML data into and start to really understand how we are applying. Using other tools to be able to validate that the information is complete, and also being able to dashboard in Power BI and other tools to understand what that data is and see where it is being applied and where it's not being applied correctly. So I wanted to jump through that quite quickly because there's some resources that I'd like to get to, but to summarize, they are compiling the invitation to tender, which is the exchange information requirements. Then we would go through this tendering process to agree on whether the team will be able to do it or not. And then we go through using that data and the task lists to automatically manage and check the responses. let's look at some resources that will simplify this and be able to train you so that you can really understand what the power in applying the ISO 19650 workflow is, and to make it easier for your company. Well, the first one is by the standards. So there are standards out there. We have a list of them available on the website. And we also break down the understanding in a series of webinars. So that would be somewhere where I would point you, I would direct you to maybe the webinars. I think there's a link later. Certainly the YouTube channels from groups like BSI and the UK BIM Alliance. We also have a BIM Management YouTube channel with a bunch of ISO 19650 explanations. The UK BIM framework is an amazing resource. It provides an understanding in a more guidance approach to unpacking the standards. Really, really useful. Lots of information there. Being able to have structured training, that's a really key step. And we are really happy to recommend many of these, but ranging from the Operam Academy, BIM Design Hub has some great resources, BRE and BSI. These are all really, really, really powerful resources to help train your teams. The workflow diagram that we looked at very briefly or through this presentation, there's a link that we have shared in the chat, and it's very simply ISO-19650-PDF at the end of the plannerly.com website. And then we also have, as I mentioned a couple of times, this series of webinars. It's actually 6 webinars that are recorded that take you through all of these steps in much more detail. If you go to the Plannerly website, there's a link right at the top for webinars. It's the ISO 19650 webinar. And then really supporting this whole workflow is the safety net. If you don't have your own templates, these are the templates that you can use, and they are supplied inside of Plannerly to make it easy. But these are templates that have been created for and by our industry. It's 100% volunteer group. There are over 200 teams, nearly 50 different countries represented, and they are the review teams that are going through managing, curating, updating these templates to meet the standards. As the standards are developing, these templates get updated. As people are implementing some more simple ways of doing things, these templates are updated, and they are an international group that are managing that workflow. So take a look there, and if you are already implementing and you are getting value and you want to improve that, please jump into that as well. It's an open group that are really, really keen to get more and more teams around the world. So I know we've covered a lot in this presentation. To summarize, we looked at lots of different acronyms, 3-letter acronyms, TLAs, like the PIR and the OIR and the AIR and the EIR and the BEP. Don't get too confused by all of that. It's terminology. It will come naturally after you start using this workflow a bit more. The framework that we are introducing to you today is starting to become this global framework that everyone is following. So really, I beckon you to get on board, and please use the resources that we shared with you to get a head start, because you will get more efficiency and you will win more business if you are following these international standards. So really, really definitely get on board and take a look and dig in more.
Very nicely presented live. Thank you so much for giving us your time, your precious time. I hope this should be your most probably 50th ISO 19650 presentation. So you are master. So thank you so much, Akash, and thank you so much both of you for giving us your time today. Thank you everyone for joining, and we will be sharing the recordings and the presentations via our social channels, so you can see. And I would suggest everyone to please share these things, and so that most of the people, they know about the information, because this is all the information and we need to share the information to educate the person. So please share. So thank you so much, Clive.
Thank you.
Have a nice day, everyone.
Take care. Enjoy your evening, everyone. Bye for now.
Bye. Thank you. Bye.